Welcome there, viewers. Today we are discussing law and order right here in the British Virgin Islands. And who better to discuss this with than our very own top cop? We are joined by Police Commissioner Mr. Michael Matthews. So we have so much to speak about, viewers, but of course you'll have to hear more after this quick commercial break.
The win! Oh!
What are the hell?
I'm freaking out!
Is time.
284 News.
Coming to you live and direct from the beautiful British Virgin Islands.
What's poppin', what's really good, what's happening, what's up?
Davis has won it for the Lakers!
Viewers, welcome back. As I said before the break, we will be discussing law and order with the Police Commissioner, Mr. Michael Matthews. First of all, I do want to thank you for joining us, Commissioner Matthews. How are you doing today?
I'm good, Kyla. Thank you. And thank you very much for the invite into your wonderful studio here today.
I want to say today is actually the first that you have joined us for our interview. Am I correct?
That is the first time here, yes.
Awesome. I'm just so honored to have this privilege to sit with you and discuss one of our top issues right here in the British Virgin Islands. So let's just get right into it, get down to the nitty-gritty of it. Of course, we are in the COVID-19 era, and as much as we don't like to speak about it and we would love to act like it's not here, we are dealing with it currently. What is law and order? What does it look like in the COVID-19 era?
Well, it's been an interesting and challenging time, I think, for law enforcement across the territory. And when I say law enforcement, Kyla, I include our good colleagues in customs and immigration as well. But, you know, with the border closures, that has gained a certain amount of control over crime. Less movement, curfews has meant that people who still want to try and commit crimes are perhaps easier to spot. Overall, the figures aren't looking disastrous. I'm still waiting on the end of September's data, but up to the end of August, we've seen a very small rise in overall crime in the territory during the COVID period. Only about 16 offences. Okay. But I think the important thing to stress here is that we've been calculating the breaches of curfew separately to the rest of our offences. There was a danger, I think, that we could come out of COVID and be marketing ourselves to the world as having a high crime rate simply because we are obliged to record every breach of curfew, and that would add to the figures. So figures looking good. We've seen year on year for the last 5 years actually a reduction in crime in the territory, awesome. Despite what some media outlets suggest to the contrary. So I'm quite pleased. But I'm sure that there are areas of concern for the communities. I'm sure there are things that you'd want to raise with regard to that.
Most definitely. So I just want to ask, do you think the economic ramifications of COVID, of course we know that many persons have been out of a job due to COVID. Do you think this has had any effect on crime whatsoever?
Well, there's no doubt about it. We were bracing ourselves for the impact of it as we saw the tighter restrictions, and our hearts went out to the many business people here who were struggling to keep a living going whilst the restrictions were being placed on, and of course necessary restrictions nonetheless to keep us all safe. So we were bracing ourselves for what we thought would be big spikes in crime.
Right.
Now, what we have seen is some what I would term isolated cases. We've seen a series of break-ins in Virgin Gorda quite recently. We've also had the quite distasteful emergence of tie-up robberies where offenders enter the home of somebody and tie them up and literally steal from them. Now, that hasn't been seen in the territory for a long while, and then we had 2 cases in a very short space of time. I've been asked many occasions since, are these type of offences emerging as a result of the state of the economy, as the result of people struggling? And of course, that's a difficult one for me to answer, and I guess when we catch people, we will ask them their reasons and they'll have to give their response to the court. What I can say, as I say, is that crime isn't spiralling as a result of COVID at the moment.
Okay, well, that is actually great news. We are very happy to hear that, but I would like to hear what has been some of the force's biggest struggles amidst COVID-19? What does that look like for the force? Of course, with crime being down, that is a great indication, but have you had any struggles throughout this time?
Well, yes, of course, the challenge has been that we've had to maintain, first of all, our workforce on the front line. And you may recall, Kyla, that we had a spike in COVID positive cases back at the beginning of September. Well, 16 of those cases were RVIPF personnel.
Oh, wow.
Now, the minute you talk about 16 cases against, 240 odd police officers, it doesn't perhaps seem a lot. But the first thing you have to do with every single case is work out who they were working with, who they've been in contact with in terms of public and work colleagues. And that tracking and tracing exercise, led by the Ministry of Health, meant that a lot more than 16 officers had to be withdrawn from the front line very, very quickly and isolated for the safety of the force and the safety, obviously, of the community. So the net effect was that we had to make some very challenging decisions. And one of those decisions was at the time when we were struggling, shall we say, in the territory with a sudden spike, we literally sent half of our police officers home and put them in isolation. So we split our shifts in half and just put half the patrols out that we would normally want to. The idea being, of course, that if it had got worse, then we had, at least 50% of our available personnel kept in a quarantine, isolated locations that could be brought back in and continue policing on behalf of our public. The net effect, of course, has been that we still have to provide our security of the border, our marine policing, our traffic policing, our crime investigations, our normal response policing on the 911 and 311,
Right.
And so the list goes on. And that's not been easy. And if I can be selfish to just take the opportunity to give credit to my officers and staff throughout this period,
Most definitely.
not just for when we had the spike in September, but going over the last few months, they've worked some extraordinary hours and have often been the only people out when curfews have been on, putting themselves on the front line at risk. And I think credit where credit's due. The RVIPF get a lot of bashing occasionally, but when I do get the opportunity to put the record straight, like I can here today, the men and women of the RVIPF have been working extremely hard on behalf of these communities over the last 8 months or so.
Most definitely. As you said, we must give credit where credit is due. Now, as you spoke about the spike during that COVID-19 spike within the force, of course. So now that we have seen this happen, of course, our police officers, our police women, men are out there on the front line. Has any protocols been put in place to make sure to somewhat secure them or from this happening again?
It's a really good question to ask as well. They are the front line, and where everybody else can retreat when we try to protect ourselves against COVID, of course we expect our police service to still continue to be out there front facing and making regular contact with the public. So the first thing we had to do is we had to make sure that there was sufficient personal protection available to our officers within the territory. So the standard things you would expect, like face masks,
Right.
Protective gowns, gloves, and of course, hand washing facilities and such like that. That's all the basics, and we hope we've got all those points covered now. But then the protocols that you kind of asked about there was something that we had to try and get the public to get their head around, because what we said to our officers is, if you get a call to a house, you don't go straight into the house. You would knock on the door and then stand a distance away and hold a conversation at a distance. If you have to stop a vehicle, you stand at a distance and ask the person to wind the window down and talk to them from a distance. Now that's not the way that policing is used to operating. We're used to front-facing, closer contact with the community. And of course, the one disadvantage police officers have is occasionally, sadly, they have to make arrests where it will require physically placing hands on an individual. And again, we've tried to give our officers enough information, and the Ministry of Health have been excellent in supporting us with this in terms of personal briefings to police officers so that they understand the risks, they understand how they can be exposed to COVID-19, and the best ways that they can go about trying to avoid that exposure, even when it comes to placing hands and having to sometimes use physical force to make an arrest.
I do understand. Now, as we move on, Commissioner Matthews, now we've been hearing a lot about the 2020 murders. The BVI has had 2 murders since the beginning of the year, Mr. George Bruce and Mr. Matthew Daly. Now, we've had some development in the last few days. One man has been charged, has been reported in the Bureau's case, and also some persons were arrested in the Daly case. Anything that you can tell us about this? Of course, we know this might be sensitive information, but anything you can tell us about these investigations?
Well, I think I want to give reassurance to the public that, of course, despite COVID and despite the lower numbers that we might have available to us through the protocols, we always prioritise the most serious of crimes. And of course, as you say, sadly, we had 2 homicides in a short space of time in September. 2nd of September was Mr. Burrows, and then the 10th of September, Mr. Daly. And of course, my deepest sympathies go out to all the family and friends and colleagues of the 2 victims, because the victims can no longer speak for themselves. So it's my job and the job of my officers to try and ensure justice. Now, they are very, very live, those 2 inquiries, but I think the reassurance is that as you've already highlighted, we have arrested and charged 1 individual in respect of Mr. Burrows' homicide, and that will now be a matter for the courts to determine. And in the other case with Mr. Daly, again, we arrested 4 persons in relation to that particular matter. They have been released at this moment in time, and it's very much still a live inquiry, and very much we will continue our investigations in that regard.
Of course, and those were just the 2020 murders. Of course, there are some unsolved murders. Do you have anything that you want to say to the community or the public as it pertains to assistance in solving these murders and crimes in our territory?
Yes, and the good news is that we are getting more cooperation from the public than we've ever got. I've always said to people, you know, you have to stand up and be counted when it comes to these kind of serious crimes. We can't just stand by and say, I'm not prepared to come forward because I don't trust the police, or, you know, it's too risky being a witness. If we all adopted that position, we wouldn't detect any crimes at all. Now, the reality of the figures are simply this, and I always refer back to, I've taken the figures back to the 1st of January in the year 2000. So let's look at around about a 20-year span.
Okay.
There's actually been 69 homicides in the territory during that period. Nothing to boast about, nothing to be proud about, a tragedy for the British Virgin Islands. But we have detected well over half of those homicides to date, and we never forget the victims and their families. So over the last 2 years, we brought in additional resources with the support of the government, and we did what we called cold case review on a number of those cases that hadn't previously been detected. And that has resulted in at least 2 further detections that have been announced previously, where people have now been charged and are going to be facing the court in relation to what we can term historic murders. And certainly, you know, in one of those cases, a murder that occurred before I was even commissioner.
Right.
So we never forget the victims, and nothing's off the table. And of course, Kyla, techniques change. You know, in 2020, 2021, there are new ways of adding to our toolbox of detecting crime. So cold case, looking back, is an essential part of our role and an essential responsibility. And where we can look back and look at the evidence that was found at the time, no matter how many years ago it was, if we can apply that evidence to modern techniques, and that leads us down, you know, new lines of inquiry, we will continue to do so.
Awesome. I do want to thank you for that. Now, as we move on, there has been just multiple reports by civilians regarding police brutality, for a lack of a better word. Now, many videos have surfaced, persons have spoken out online. Most recently, a concerned mother posted about, you know, intimidation of her teenage sons by police officers. You may have heard about that. I want to hear your thoughts on this.
Well, for sure. First of all, let me apologise to anybody who feels that any of my officers have got it wrong and haven't dealt with a situation appropriately. We don't go out there with an intent to cause problems for the public. Our primary aim is to protect the public. Now, we don't always get it right, and when people raise concerns, I take that personally very seriously, and we have a capability built into our system where we will investigate ourselves and be held to account. Now, there is some cynicism around that you know, the police investigating themselves, you know, how honest are they going to be? But we can't just bring in another police force or another team of investigators from outside, and even if we could, COVID has made that almost impossible going forward. And it would cost some significant amounts of money. But one has to ask a question. In whose interest would it be for me to be sitting here idly defending my officers, trying to cover things up and not being accountable? It's certainly not in the interest of policing. It's certainly not in the interest of the Commissioner of Police, because all that does is it creates suspicion, it destroys confidence in the communities at a time when people need greater reassurance. You know, we're in a challenging old time in the world, and the BVI is no exception. So where we get it wrong, the public are always welcome to draw that to my attention. It will be investigated, and the most recent incident that you've spoken about, I would like to place on record my thanks actually to the lady who raised the concerns, because she was honest enough and kind enough to also further 24 hours later put up a second notice on Facebook pointing out that we had reached out and made contact, and that one of my senior officers had gone out of his way to seek to give an initial explanation. But it shouldn't end there. They are entitled to answers, and we will question the officers that were involved in that incident and any other witnesses, and we will do our best to get to the bottom of any concerns and, most importantly, provide an answer to people who are concerned about police actions.
I do understand that, and that is a very valid point. Of course, this was something that was posted via Facebook, but do we think that maybe an official stream of communication, if there are any complaints, how does that go? Or even have we thought about maybe an internal affairs unit? Because I think many persons ask, who policed the policeman? And as you said, you know, it is not in your best interest to somewhat cover that up, but persons might be concerned with, how do I go about this if I have an issue with law enforcement?
Well, complaints can be made either in writing or in person. The Professional Standards Department, as they are known, are based within police headquarters, and we are now back in our proper police headquarters. We're no longer in the Right Way supermarket. And they are an independent team. They've been trained and they're set up there to interview people who make complaints and then to undertake investigations and provide answers. And very often, when that team do act, we get to the bottom of something very, very quickly, and we're able to satisfy a number of members of the public very, very quickly that what has happened won't happen again, or that, you know, sometimes it wasn't as bad as they perceived.
Right.
Equally, and this is an important point, some of those cases do lead to internal discipline with regard to officers. And only this week I met with a family on Tuesday evening to explain what actions I was going to take against some officers with regard to allegations made in respect of a complaint they had put forward. So, as I say, it's not in our interest to seek to cover this up, but the point I think you might have made quite well there, and I'm glad you've raised it, is not everybody knows how to make a complaint. But you simply can ring 311 and be asked to put through to the Professional Standards Department, or even if you can't remember that name, just say, I want to make a complaint against police, and they'll know to put you through to the department.
Awesome stuff. But of course, as you said, the police officers, law enforcement is here to protect. Of course, there may be some situations where there is some misunderstanding, but before we go, I want you to speak a little bit to how can we bridge that gap between our public and our police officers?
Well, the truth is that we police as a democracy. We police by consent. We should never be policing by just the use of force. So doing things with the community has to be the answer, not doing things to the community. We've tried our very best to deliver a community-style policing, but we're still on a journey, and it needs to be better enhanced as we go forward. Now, the hurricanes pushed us back, COVID has pushed us back, but our strategic aim is to eventually have dedicated community police officers back in the community where they're known locally, the community know how to contact them all times of the night and day, and that they create a bond between the community and the police service. And it should be that way. I said earlier that we are getting greater cooperation than we've ever seen from people coming forward in the most serious of instances.
Awesome.
And that's good, because that means that there is greater confidence going forward in the community. But there's still more to do, and we're still on a journey.
Most definitely. Now, Commissioner Matthews, we do have to wrap up, and I think that our time was a bit too short, but I definitely want to invite you back because we have so much more to speak about as it pertains to law and order and law enforcement in our territory. It's definitely a large spectrum to cover, but I definitely want to thank you for joining me today. Definitely an awesome conversation. Anything else you would like to say to the public before we sign off?
I always thank the public for their continued cooperation. I always stress that the RVIPF don't always get things right, but I would stress, let's not judge their actions through a trial by media. Let's do it properly. If you've got a complaint, come and make the complaint. Let's investigate it properly. But I'd be delighted to come back again. It's been a real pleasure talking to you today.
Awesome, and I will definitely be holding you to that. Viewers, of course, I am Kyla Kenesha Forbes. Have a good day.